if you'll remember back a little bit, you will remember that we initially talked about the fact that there are two ways to think about how language actually works. One being the formal rules of a language, and the other, the way it's actually spoken. So in anthropology, we have descriptive linguistics, which is what we just talked about, right? The systematic analysis of the sound system and grammar. Okay, so we just finished talking about that. The next option is sociolinguistics, and this is kind of a newer trend in linguistic anthropology. But what we're studying here is how the culture actually affects the normal use of a language. And so this is where we're talking about how a language is actually used rather than saying how a language should be used. Okay, so here we're going to focus on signs, symbols, and metaphors within a culture, and then how the language is being used by the people in that culture. The easiest place to talk about dialects is in this context. And so again, we're going to get into this discussion of the colloquial use of the terms dialect and accent and the academic use. So usually you hear, say, for example, people saying that someone has a southern accent. Really, in fact, they're using that term incorrectly. Dialect is the term they're looking for. So dialects are mutually intelligible, regional, or social varieties of a single language. So if you have a southern sound to your English, that's a dialect. You're speaking the same language. And so prior to the 1970s, we kind of thought that American English would become increasingly homogenous. And we thought that was going to come about because of mass media and what they refer to as the standardization of unaccented English. And this still holds true within mass media, but not within the public itself. So in the media, you hear what is supposed to be unaccented English, and it's something that newscasters and things try to learn. Okay, but really that didn't contribute to the actual functioning of the language, and instead regional dialects and changes between generations or within communities are greater than ever. Okay, and what's important here is that this suggests that peer groups and the people you actually interact with on a daily basis, instead of just seeing on TV, but the people you're actually interacting with and the language you use there is much more important in the transmission of linguistic form instead of media and maybe the way language is supposed to be spoken. And so if a dialect is speaking the same language with different sounds, then an accent is speaking a different language. So accents can only occur if you're speaking your non-native language. So I can speak Spanish with an English accent. I can't speak Spanish with an English dialect. Okay, so dialect is within your own language and accent is across languages. And so when I do this section, I tend to, in my face-to-face class, talk with my stereotypical West Virginia dialect or Appalachian dialect. And so sometimes when you hear people talk, I talk like this, and this might be an example of a dialect instead of an accent. Okay, so I have right now a West Virginia dialect. That's because I'm currently speaking English, which is my native language. Now, if I were to speak Spanish, then that would be with an accent. But here, right now, I'm using a dialect. Okay, so to use a dialect, again, it has to be the same language, so different ways of saying the same language. And then accent is speaking across languages.